Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Koger, Managing Editor of Vegetable Growers News, which is a sister publication to Spudman. Today's webinar, Increasing Nutrient Efficiency in Potatoes, is brought to you by ICL. Our guests today are Dr. A.J. Foster, who is a certified professional agronomist and crop advisor, and Dr. Jason Haegele, who is ICL's North American agronomy lead. We'll be looking at phosphorus management for potatoes, including the latest research on managing soil and fertilizer pH as a tool for maximizing phosphorus. This webinar is eligible for 1 CEU credit, and at the end of the webinar, there'll be a QR code for you to scan. Now, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We'll make time at the end of the webinar to answer as many as we can. Now, I would like to welcome our guests, Jason and AJ. Welcome and thanks for presenting today.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. We're appreciative of this opportunity to highlight ICL again. We had a similar webinar this past year focused on polysulfate, and today we'll be shifting our focus to phosphorus management in potatoes. Caroline, if you go on to the next slide, please. I'd first like to say a little bit about ICL because, to many, ICL is an unfamiliar, company. Some might think that ICL is a new company, but in fact, we're a rather old company, having been around for now 100 years, globally. ICL is based in Tel Aviv, Israel, and over the course of 100 years has developed into a global specialty minerals company focused on many different industries that utilize minerals, including phosphate salts for the food industry, now getting into the lithium iron battery industry for electric vehicles and other renewable energy using electricity, bromine for flame retardants, and also looking at fertilizers, particularly specialty fertilizers and specialty crop care solutions across the world. Next slide, please. So as we think about potatoes and just crop management in general, certainly plant nutrition and soil fertility is the foundation for much of the success that we have in growing crops, and much of the success and need for human and animal nutrition. When we think about optimizing potato production, and this can be said of any crop really, this requires nutrients applied in a 4R strategy. When you think about the 4R strategy, it's the right place, the right source, the right time, and at the right rate. When we think about potatoes and many other specialty crops and vegetable crops, oftentimes these are grown on irrigated, coarse textured soils, and so with that environment of irrigation and coarse textured soil, there can be challenges in managing nutrients and ensuring that those nutrients are present in the soil and available to the crop when it needs it. And there certainly are many opportunities for improving nutrient use efficiency. Specifically thinking about potatoes, phosphorus is often applied at high rates for potato production, due to their responsiveness to phosphorus inputs. And the question that we want to ask today is there an opportunity to improve phosphorus use efficiency with a different source? Specifically thinking about PeKacid and Agrolution pHLow that we'll highlight and talk about today. And by using those sources, is there a different rate or a reduced rate of phosphorus input that we can potentially enable by looking at these different sources of phosphorus nutrition? So what are the solutions that ICL can provide? Last year in our Spudman webinar, we talked about polysulfate, which is a unique sustained release source of potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium to deliver nutrients when the potato crop needs them. And today we're going to focus and talk about PeKacid, which is a water-soluble acidifying phosphorus and potassium fertilizer with an analysis of 0, 60, and 20, and then a closely related water-soluble nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium containing fertilizer called Agrolution pHLow. We'll talk about some trial results from those products later, but we'll set the stage for why these products are potentially needed and potentially why they are effective, particularly for starter fertilizer applications in potatoes and other crops. Next slide, please. So with that introduction, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. A.J. Foster, who has substantial experience in the potato industry, having worked most recently for Lamb Weston in the Pacific Northwest. And AJ, the question that I'd like to pose to you is, as we think about potatoes, why is phosphorus so important to potatoes, and why do potatoes seem to respond to phosphorus even when soil test values would suggest that additional phosphorus fertilizer is really not needed?
Well, Jason, thank you. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So in answering your question, why is phosphorus so important for potatoes? Why don't we look at the uptake curve or the demand curve for potatoes? And we'll see, when you look at those demand curves, you'll see that phosphorus doesn't strike you as you see the highest there is potassium, then nitrogen, and then phosphorus would be your next in line. But when you look at it from that standpoint, you look at it in terms of the magnitude. And what you see there is the curves looks the same. They follow the same trend, but they differ in magnitude. And with that, we see that typically nitrogen demand is about, in most crops, is around 10 times that of phosphorus. So it's a 10-to-1 ratio. And I got we got an open menu here. Oh, sorry about that. So typically you got a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of nitrogen to phosphorus. And with that, but yet still, when we think about how we fertilize, we don't really fertilize phosphorus on a 10-to-1 ratio. We tend to, if we look at potatoes, for example, what I've seen in my experience working on potatoes is the average rate of phosphorus going on potatoes is probably around anything from 200 to up to 350 pounds of P2O5. And if we look at the average rates of nitrogen going out, that would be also probably around 250 to around 400 pounds. So in general, what we're seeing is a 3-to-1 ratio going on when we apply phosphorus. Even though when we're looking at these demand, it's pretty much on a 10-to-1 ratio if you look at those numbers and look at the demand there. So that's pretty interesting. Why are we putting on at a 3-to-1 when the crop is using at a 10-to-1? And that has to do with a lot with also the efficiency of phosphorus, which is kind of what we'll talk about in terms of that demand. We're looking to that efficiency of getting that phosphorus into that plant and why we're applying such higher rates to be able to do that. Next slide. So this is a related to that question, this is a study that was done by White and others back in 2009. And they did a meta-analysis, and that is they went through the literature and looked at a lot of the phosphorus, the nutrient studies that was done on potatoes. And they were trying to answer the question, is it possible to establish a relationship between the plant nutrient concentration and the yield in potatoes? And they were measuring the nutrient concentration in the tubers. And what they found was very interesting to me. And at that time, I looked at this paper back in around 2019. And I was just starting my career in the potato industry. And I remember sitting down with a guy named Steve Allen. And he's really been a consultant in potato industry for many years. Spent a lot of time with Steve, and he's kind of teaching me a lot about potato and potato production. But I started to think about what nutrients really dominated potato production, coming from a fertility background myself. So when I found this article, I found it very interesting that it identified 2 nutrients to be strongly related to potato yield. The first one was phosphorus. And I'm like, okay, phosphorus. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Steve did talk about that. And so we talk a lot about the importance of phosphorus. But the second was copper, and that one caught me by surprise. I never thought copper would be such an interesting one of those nutrients that impact potato yield. But in my years looking at a lot of soil and petiole and application and yield, I started to dive down to look at these relationships. And I can confirm these results that yes, phosphorus is one of the biggest driver of potato yields. And copper also is very important in potato yield as well. And we did find a relationship where as copper levels increase, we did tend to see also increase in potato yields. And that's a story for another day to talk about copper, but our focus today is on phosphorus and the importance of phosphorus for potato yields. And so this study from that meta-analysis did confirm and shows phosphorus being one of the important nutrients for potatoes. Most of the work I've looked at have also shown very similar results. Next slide. This is of some work from Westerman. And I would say if I should give a prize for a guy that I've done some of the most interested and important work on potato fertility, that would probably goes to Westerman of the work he did on potato fertility in the PNW. And he's looking at the relationship between yield and the petiole phosphorus. And he's looking at it over time through the growing season. And interesting, what you see is very high phosphorus, high petiole phosphorus. It correlates very strongly with relatively high tuber yields. So high phosphorus, when it was starting at about 2000 ppm right there, it's almost, you reach about 100% relative yield. Low phosphorus levels, when you started out, very low phosphorus levels, you're seeing you're probably less than closer to that 50%. And interestingly, when you look at the end, closer to those final samples, there's not much difference in the petiole numbers at the end. The big difference is initially, early in the season. That early season difference in having higher phosphorus petiole levels is so important in terms of maximizing your potato yield. So Westerman concluded that there's a need to maintain high phosphorus concentration in the petiole, because this is real, that's a strong relation to your potato, your yield potential. And we have seen that from the work I've done, looking at a lot of soil and petiole and yield and application data, where I've seen that within that first 50 to 70 days after planting, you really want that phosphorus levels to be the highest in the plant, especially around that 65 to 70 days. I could tell if I see fields that are coming back with low petiole numbers around that 60 to 70 day range, predominantly most of the time, those fields end up showing lower yields. Next slide. So this is a slide that shows that there's more and more questions related to phosphorus management on potatoes. And this is something that Dr. Carl Rosen is working on there in Minnesota. And again, if I was to give a prize for the guy who is now currently doing a lot of good potato research on fertility, that would go to Carl and a lot of the work he's doing. And Carl started this work because growers started to look at newer varieties. So we started to see where growers were saying there's newer varieties, they had to be putting on more phosphorus. So the newer varieties were showing very high responsiveness to high rates of phosphorus, even though soil test was tested high. So what he saw was, he showed that up to 500 pounds of P2O5, and he was still seeing response on some of these newer varieties, even though the soil test was testing high. So most researchers, we ask questions. So the question is, and you do the research to try to answer that question. So Carl wants to know why. Why are we seeing these responses? Is the growers are just talking about it, or is this really real? And that's how he set up the study, looking at different rates from 75 to up to 450 pounds of P2O5. And what did he learn? From that work, he started to see varieties like Ivory Russet was showing a linear increase with increased rates of phosphorus. And that's what he saw in the first year. In the second year, he saw similar results, another linear increase, but this time he saw for both varieties. Interestingly, for me, from my experience looking at a lot of these varieties, the newer varieties tend to be more responsive to higher phosphorus. Varieties like Burbank tend not to be as responsive. They're more nitrogen driven than they're phosphorus driven. So this results, but one of the things I tend to notice through my years is and I love to hear some feedback on this, on some comments. If you have high rainfall in the spring, a lot of rainfall in the spring, I tend to see lower rates of petiole numbers coming back with deficiency or low levels versus if you have a dry spring. A drier spring, you tend to see a lot more fields coming back with much lower phosphorus levels early on. And so I would love to hear if you guys have observed that as well. But that I don't know the exact year, what year 2 was, but that to look at the weather condition, that could also play a role in the difference with Burbank, especially because Burbank tends to be a lot less responsive to higher phosphorus than we see with the newer varieties. Next slide. I put this slide in because I like to talk, a lot of times when we think of phosphorus, we tend to mainly, I think we think of it in a similar way to nitrogen. And it's very important for us to understand that the mechanism of phosphorus uptake differs from the mechanism of nitrogen uptake. Nitrogen is uptake, as we see on this chart, majority of it goes by mass flow. Phosphorus, majority goes by diffusion. So when we think of it, that's a big difference between a mass flow uptake and a diffusion uptake. When you think of it by diffusion, diffusion is moving from an area of high concentration, across a gradient, high concentration to low concentration. So there are some conditions that are important to have for that to happen. Nutrient concentration, very important. Placement and root development. These are big factors when you're thinking of phosphorus, getting phosphorus into that plant. So if you have high, and in that root, you have to have because it's moving from a high concentration, that means the roots inside the root has to have low concentration. So you got to be moved so you can have that movement from the soil of high concentration into that root of lower concentration. And you got to have movement of that phosphorus in that root to create that consistent deficit gradient to move the phosphorus in. So we'll see root mass and the amount of roots that's there, how we place the phosphorus in that soil will play a big critical role in how we get that phosphorus into that plant. And also with the amount of nutrient, the concentration of phosphorus available in that soil. Next slide, please. So this slide just to show a little more detail the importance of roots and that root mass in terms of phosphorus uptake. And what it shows here is that here a root length density greater than 2, you see your uptake of phosphorus was almost 20% compared to when it's less than 2 of 5% of the potassium is also uptake by diffusion. So it follows very similar trend. So where you see more root mass, more uptake of that potassium as well. Less root mass, less uptake. So in managing for phosphorus, we always have to think of those conditions, the nutrient concentration, the placement, and how you're developing that root mass.
Well, thank you for that overview, AJ. I think that sets the stage for kind of the next phase of our webinar. Now, if you want to go to the next slide, Caroline. And based on the information you shared from Dr. Rosen's study in Minnesota, it would seem that soil testing, like what we do currently for potatoes and other crops, may not completely reflect the potential response of a potato crop. So why don't you talk to us now a little about soil testing, kind of the high level overview of the theory behind soil testing. Let's also talk a little bit about the influence of soil pH and acidity on availability of nutrients, not just phosphorus but other nutrients as well, and how that potentially relates to phosphorus availability in different key potato growing regions of North America, United States specifically. So Go ahead to the next slide, please, Caroline.
Okay. So to answer your question, Jason, on soil testing, let's just spend a little bit of time and review on the concept of soil testing and I've always asked this question on soil testing is, when we think of soil testing for potassium, we have a very few extractants available. We use ammonium pretty much across the country. We use ammonium acetate. When we get for phosphorus, there is a lot of different extractants, lots of different. Here I just have a few here: Bray 1, Bray 2, the Olsen, and the Mehlich 3. And there's many more phosphorus extractants out there. So the question, why do we have so many different extractants for phosphorus and not as many for potassium? But a lot of that is depend on the nature of phosphorus and what we're trying to measure when we're measuring phosphorus and the soil environment in which we're trying to measure the phosphorus in. So if we take Bray 1, for example, and Bray 2, we look at both of those. One of the things, what's the difference between both of those? They both have an hydrochloric acid. The difference is the concentration of hydrochloric acid. And what are they measuring? So what are these? So in measuring the phosphorus, we're putting an acid. So all these soil extractant uses an acid. And here we're seeing 1 to 7 base soil ratio, 60 seconds, 40 seconds, then, and I have the difference in terms of the extraction period or shaking period. But what you're putting in is an acid. If we think about the Bray 1, Bray 2, where were they developed? They were developed in the Southeast, in the Carolinas. And what are the type of soils there? Most are you got the coastal plains and some alluvial soil. So what's predominate those soils? You're talking about your aluminum and your iron phosphates. That's going to bind it. So you need a stronger acid to release that phosphorus. So what they're measuring there is the capacity of that soil to supply phosphorus. That's really what they're measuring, is the capacity of the soil to supply phosphorus. So they're using the acid to break down those aluminum and iron and some calcium in order to see how much release capacity of that soil to supply phosphorus. You look at the Olsen test, which uses sodium bicarbonate, and this was developed in Colorado. So you're talking on a higher pH in a different type of environment. And so what are they measuring when they use sodium bicarbonate on most likely we recommend Olsen mainly on high pH soils, pH above 7.5. Why? So what it's measuring is intensity. It's measuring the amount of phosphate in solution. It's not acidifying and breaking any of those minerals. It's just measuring the solubility, how much phosphorus is in solution that's available. Bear in mind, you're thinking of an environment that has pH of 7.5. So there's no acidity in there. So they're measuring solution, how much phosphorus would be available in solution. So those are things to bear in mind when thinking about these. So what you're actually measuring. Mehlich 3 similarly is measuring the capacity. Again, it has that nitric acid in there. So it's measuring the capacity of that soil to supply phosphorus. So these are different, the way these are measured. But what the biggest point I want to point out here is when we think of soil tests, what we're doing is we're applying an acid to the soil, except for the Olsen, in order to release to determine how much phosphate will be available. So that's what we're doing here. And I want you guys to we're applying an acid, we're shaking it, and then we're measuring the capacity of that soil to supply phosphate. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, we just talked about acidity, which ties into pH. So we don't talk about pH, we're talking about acidity. So we know that soil pH has significant impact on soil and fertility chemistry. And so one of my professors always said about soil pH and acidity, if you have a high pH soils, so which we find high pH soil has no acidity in there. And so above 7.5. So he always says that's like buying a brand new car and taking the wheels off, because you're not going to get anywhere. You need acidity for the system to work. And most times we see where most of the nutrients availability is within that acidic range. Most times we're talking slightly acidic, 6.5 to within that neutral, a little bit above neutral. And there is still a lot of times when we could talk a lot of questions about this chart because the way it was done, and there's lots of questions because it doesn't reflect rhizosphere pH. So with that, and that's a conversation for another day. But next slide. So this is a very you cannot talk about phosphorus and not bring this chart up. This is pretty much when you just can't. Any conversation on phosphorus in soil, we're going to talk about showing this chart that shows the amount of phosphorus fixation based on pH, based on iron, aluminum, and the calcium, and where majority of that phosphorus is available. And where we see that majority of the availability of that phosphorus is within that 6. It's around 5.5 to around 7, little over 7.3 pH, where majority of that phosphorus will be available. I like to say in phosphorus management, the most important thing is the availability, is making phosphorus available. And that's really what you're doing. When you're managing phosphorus, your number one goal is trying to make phosphorus available. Next slide, please. So when we look at potato production across the US, where is it located? Majority of our potato is located in the Western United States. And so we have some in the basin area in Washington and in Idaho. And so what's predominant in those areas is high pH soils with high, and if you get into Idaho, also high bicarbonates. So there's more high bicarbonated soils in Idaho compared to the basin. But those are some of the conditions we're dealing with in these dominant potato areas: high pH and high carbonates in those soils. Next slide, please. And if we overlay that on a pH map, what do we see? We'll see that those areas, just as I mentioned, high pH, much higher, with your blue representing those higher pH areas, and that's where we're seeing that. And even in Colorado, where you have some potato production, we're seeing where predominantly those higher pH soil environment. As you move, a lot of that, as you move across the US, I like to say you can follow the rainfall pattern across the US, and that will give you a good indication of the pH across the United States. And so as you get into the eastern, that's where you see majority of your lower pH, as well as it tells you the vegetation as well. Most over there is mainly the trees and pasture areas. And we have over here is more irrigated, and the potato production here. But pH, just want to make that connection between the potato growing areas and the higher pH.
Well, thanks, AJ. And I think the other point to make here is that while we focused on soil pH and the influence of soil pH on nutrient availability, we also have to think about water quality. The pH of water used for irrigation, used for creating foliar application blends or starter fertilizer blends, because the pH of water can influence the reaction or the association of calcium and phosphorus, and a high pH calcium rich water can certainly reduce the availability of phosphorus as well.
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Next slide. So So as Jason just mentioned, as we talk about those high pH and those environments, so it's important for us to be able to acidify or bring some level of acidity into these alkaline soils. As I said, when you have those soils, it's like buying a brand new car and taking the wheels off, because you really need to get some acidity into those soils. So I like to say this: acidity is the currency in the soil. So if you think in terms of in the soil's economy, to make nutrients available, you need acidity. You need to get some acidity into that soil. So it's kind of like if the plant is saying in the soil, here is 2 hydrogen, give me a calcium. Here's a couple of hydrogen, give me. So it's really the acidity and the hydrogen in the system that's creating and allowing for these exchange to happen. So that's why we see most of our availability is within that slightly acidic range, where you have some level of acidity. So when you think about it, when you have some amount of acidity, you have enough money and you can buy stuff. When you have too much acidity, it's like having a lot of money, but nothing to buy. So that's kind of the difference. You get too acidic, you have lots of money, but you can't buy anything. But you want just enough money to buy and lots of stuff to buy. And so that's kind of where it falls with the slightly acidic. As I mentioned, soil tests use acids. And so we have to realize that, because in terms of measuring phosphorus, they're using acid to be able to extract that, determine the capacity to supply. And the composition of the soil reflects the quality of the water applied, just as Jason mentioned. So if you're putting on hard water, it's the soil is going to, with the high calcium or high bicarbonate, that's what the soil is. Your soil test, your soils will reflect that. So just like we show that pH map, if you think of just the amount of rainfall, which is rainfall itself is acidic, and you're getting more rainfall in an area, the soil reflects that. So the soil reflects whatever the composition of the water that you're applying. So that's something. So you not just think about the soil, but you also got to think about the quality of the irrigation water as well. And use of acid forming fertilizer does provide some ability in terms of bringing in acidity into that soil. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about more today on the function of our acidifying fertilizers. Next slide.
Well, perhaps before we go into the next phase of our webinar, we can pause and Chris, are there any questions we can answer at this point before we go ahead?
Yeah, we have a question here. History for us shows a high phosphorus soil test, and we add additional phosphorus fertilizer, both banded and broadcast. Then petiole samples come back high in the early season, but about mid-season, the petiole samples come down until late season, the petiole reads deficient. We have not been able to overcome this. Any ideas how to overcome that?
So the question is on the petiole on phosphorus, what we have seen over the years with petiole, so it's going to start high, and at around day 65 to around 75, once that plant starts to flower, that petiole phosphorus is going to drop. It's going to drop. There's nothing you can do. It's going to drop. And applying more, you may get it to bump back up, but you're going to see it moving back down. So the key is really, as you're talking about putting the band, is trying to get it as high as possible before it gets to that flowering stage. So that because it's going to drop no matter. And you have seen, as you mentioned, you have seen that through the years. It's going to drop, but it's how low should it drop is the concern. The higher you start, the higher you're going to maintain it when it drops. And we like to maintain, depending on variety, but you want to maintain above a 0.2. You don't want it dropping below 0.2. Until you get to real late in the season, probably 110, 120 days after planting.
So if I understand that correctly, AJ, that drop that we see in the petiole phosphorus is remobilization, as the tubers start to bulk, and really the way that we can ensure that plant has enough phosphorus, for the end of the season is to build that reservoir as high as we can early in the season. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, that is correct. And another thing to remember there is the way potato roots grow. So once it flowers, that roots are reach maximum production, maximum. You're not really going to get more root growth. So we like to say the roots, it grows, it gets, and then you start losing root mass after that. So that's, so think of phosphorus. We'll talk about phosphorus, important nutrients concentration, placement, and roots. So if you start losing root mass, it means that your uptake of phosphorus is also declining as you, and then most of that focus is now on the bulking. You're still getting uptake, but not at the extent as you were getting early in the season. So early in the season is important with your banding and the things you're doing to get as much phosphorus into that plant.
Okay, thanks, AJ. Well, AJ, set the stage, and you talked about the importance of acidity as the currency for plant nutrient uptake. You highlighted the idea that many of the major potato growing regions of the U.S., particularly those in the western United States, are on high pH soils, which can influence phosphorus availability. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about the solution to the agronomic challenge that we've revealed. And we're going to specifically talk about ICL's products, Nova PeKacid and Agrolution pHLow. If you go on to the next slide, we'll set the stage and talk about PeKacid, specifically, as that is the the foundation for the technology within Agrolution pHLow as well. PeKacid is a proprietary product to ICL. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, ICL is a 100-year-old company based in Israel, and certainly Israel has many agricultural challenges, raising crops essentially in the desert. Irrigated agriculture with very challenging water conditions, high pH soils, but also high pH water, and oftentimes saline water as well. So because of those unique challenges in Israel, there have been many innovations related to agriculture that have come out of that country, including technologies like drip irrigation, and in turn approaches to apply nutrients through drip irrigation systems or other forms of micro irrigation. Within these drip irrigation systems, the buildup of calcium carbonates and other insoluble materials over time can reduce the effectiveness of those irrigation systems. So Nova PeKacid was originally developed as an acidifying source of phosphorus and potassium, to help deliver those nutrients, phosphorus and potassium, but also through that lower pH or acidity to help keep those irrigation systems clean and functioning for as long as possible. Nova PeKacid is relatively or very acidic in solution. A 1% solution of PeKacid has a pH of about 2.2. So through this reduction of alkalinity and pH, it enables better micronutrient availability. TE stands for trace element, but also enables more soluble phosphorus and enables the co-fertigation or the co-application of calcium solutions and phosphorus solutions through these irrigation systems by maintaining that low pH in those high pH conditions or those hard water conditions. And you see that example there in the bottom right picture where we have calcium and magnesium in a normal nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium solution, and that cloudiness is the precipitation that's occurring through the reaction of calcium and phosphorus under higher water pH conditions. Whereas with PeKacid, by lowering the pH, we can you supply that phosphorus, but also keep it in solution with calcium and magnesium in that solution as well. Next slide, please. So a few years ago here in the U.S., in Arizona, working with a research collaborator there, we did some trials to really understand the impact of applying PeKacid on soil nutrient availability. Looking at different heavier clay soils from the desert Southwest, clay soils with high CEC and high pH as well. In this trial, in this specific example, you see the starting pH was 8.1 for the untreated control, and then for the three treatments below that, those are different rates of PeKacid applied at roughly 10, 15, and 20 pounds of product per acre. With that increasing rate of PeKacid, you see the reduction in pH. You measured from the liquid that's being passed through these soil columns. So we have starting pH of 8.1 with the untreated control, and then with increasing rates of PeKacid, we go all the way down to 6.7. If you look over to the right or at the graphs below as well, we have potassium and phosphorus. Those are increasing significantly with the addition of PeKacid, as you would expect, because this nutrient applies phosphorus and potassium. But if you do the math, the increases in the part per million levels would also suggest that we're making nutrition in the soil more available compared to what it was before, through the reduction in pH. And that kind of comes back to the concept that AJ you introduced with soil testing, where we're using acids to estimate the nutrients that are contained within the soil. Also highlighted here is magnesium. So although PeKacid doesn't contain any magnesium, we were seeing an increase in magnesium that's contained within the leachate from these soil columns, suggesting that a reduction in pH was liberating some of the magnesium contained within the cation exchange capacity, making it more available to the plant. Before we go on, AJ, is there anything that stands out to you here, or anything that you want to add on this slide?
Yeah, just one thing I'd like to point out, and that is just to demonstrate the acidifying power of the PeKacid. Remember, pH is a logarithmic scale. So you're moving from an 8.1 to a 7.3. That's almost a 10-fold change in pH. So that tells you, but bear in mind, this soil has no free lime in there. So that means buffer capacity of the soil is not as high. But we'll see as you increase buffer capacity, you probably will still see some acidifying, but not that 10-fold drop, but you will still see some level. And that's where rates, the amount and the rate of PeKacid comes into play when you start to have more free lime in the system.
Thank you. Next slide. So transitioning away from PeKacid, closely related product is Agrolution pHLow. There is an entire family of Agrolution pHLow products with different NPK analyses. But today we're going to focus on Agrolution pHLow 114511 as the example. And this product also contains a small percentage of zinc as well, 2% zinc in this particular product, which we are evaluating in the U.S. as a starter fertilizer opportunity for potatoes, as well as some other crops. And we'll show some examples of that here in a minute. Agrolution pHLow, this family of products contains PeKacid as one of the sources of phosphorus and potassium. And so because of that, it has the same acidifying properties of PeKacid itself, along with the additional benefits of nitrogen and micronutrients like zinc in this example, and there are micronutrients in some of the other Agrolution pHLow products as well. Depending on the application for different fertigation applications and soil applications, primarily using this acidifying technology. Next slide. So as we transition into the trials that we're going to highlight, we've compared Agrolution pHLow 114511 versus 1034O or ammonium polyphosphate as the grower standard practice. Across the U.S., 1034O is a common liquid starter fertilizer for potatoes and other crops as well. Relatively low cost, compared to some other options. But as we look at this comparison between Agrolution pHLow 114511 and 1034O, there are some differences to be aware of and to highlight. With Agrolution pHLow, this is a water-soluble fertilizer, so it's starting in a dry form and has to be solubilized. But it's easy to handle and a good quality product with excellent storability. One of the other key features of 114511 compared to 1034O is that Agrolution pHLow, it has a low salt index, so potentially safer placed directly in the furrow close to the seed, or in the case of potatoes, the seed piece. We'll talk about the lower use rate, or the potential lower use rate, with some of our trial examples. And certainly with Agrolution pHLow, we have a micronutrient, zinc specifically, and potassium as well. And then finally, the PeKacid component that lowers the pH of the final solution. With 1034O, this is a liquid, obviously, when you talk about orthophosphates and polyphosphates, polyphosphates in the case of 1034O do convert to orthophosphates over time, even in storage, and that can create some challenges with compatibility, specifically thinking about micronutrients. High rates of 1034O applied in furrow can be risky due to the higher salt index and crop injury potential of 1034O. And if micronutrients or potassium are of interest, certainly 1034O does not contain those. AJ, is there anything that you want to add before we move ahead?
No, I mean, I think Mike, like 114511, I mean, compared to 1034O, I think 1034O probably, when it was developed by TVA, it's a great technology at the time, and as a liquid phosphorus and what it brings. But I think in a lot of environment, like in those high pH environment where 114511, and when we just the acidifying nature, and when we think about sustainability, which is and fertility, we have to think about lower rates, lower application rates as we think about sustainable fertility management. And that's where Agrolution pHLow, to me, does offer that. Another value is that lower use rate is so important from a sustainable standpoint.
Jason, we do have a question here. I don't know if you need more information behind this to answer it, but the question is, what's the difference in prices between Agrolution pHLow and ammonium polyphosphate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly with Agrolution pHLow being a water soluble fertilizer, high quality water soluble fertilizer, it will be more expensive on a per pound of P2O5 basis. Just ballpark, will be about 3 times more expensive per pound of P2O5. And to many that will come as a sticker shock, but when we think about how we will recommend using this product and some of the trial results that you will see, we need to go beyond just looking at the the pure cost of the product, but think about the rate at which it will be applied, and then the ROI associated with the yield increase that you might potentially see. So with potatoes, I think that's something that we're still thinking about and working through with our trials, to understand the right rate, and not necessarily completely replacing 1034O, but using Agrolution pHLow as a supplement to bring that acidity and improve the phosphorus availability overall. And AJ will talk more about that in our conclusion and the recommendation. Caroline, if you go ahead 2 slides, I'm going to talk about corn and soybean, actually, just as an example for illustrating some concepts here. And these particular examples, with the increase in yield that we see, as well as the rates that were used, we actually have a very strong ROI from using Agrolution pHLow, as opposed to the grower standard practice of 1034O. I see another question here that I'll quickly answer is Agrolution pHLow only starter? The answer is no. It is for soil application, but could be applied anytime in season to the soil when you would apply apply phosphorus. Can also be applied through an irrigation system for fertigation. It doesn't necessarily have to be injected into the soil with the planter or with some type of side dress machine. So. So again, I know these aren't potato examples, but I want to talk briefly about corn and soybeans, because these are really excellent data sets that we had from this past year from Wisconsin that show the concept that we're trying to highlight. Both of these trials were in southern Wisconsin, near Whitewater, Wisconsin, on a soil with a pH of about 7 or slightly over 7. The grower standard practice was APP, ammonium polyphosphate, or 1034O, applied at 3 gallons per acre. And compared to that, we had 2 different rates of Agrolution pHLow 114511 applied at 6 pounds per acre and 12 pounds per acre. So the first point that I want to make is that 3 gallons per acre of 1034O, when you do the math, is about 11 pounds. I think it's 10.9 pounds of P2O5 applied per acre. 6 pounds per acre of 114511 is about 2.7 pounds of P2O5 and 12 pounds of Agrolution pHLow 114511 would be about 5.5 pounds of P2O5. So as we look at this data and the gray bars, the second, fourth, and sixth gray bars, which are just the different starter fertilizer treatments, we have essentially equivalent performance between 1034.0 and our 2 Agrolution pHLow rates, suggesting that we can get the same yield increase over the control with substantially less phosphorus applied. The other key thing that I want to highlight in this slide is the combination of starter fertilizer, whether that's 1034.0 or Agrolution pHLow, with a fulvic acid. AJ talked earlier about rooting density and how that impacts phosphorus uptake. Fulvic acid, humic acid are some of the options that are used to increase rooting as well as nutrient uptake. And we do see a nice benefit or synergy between using starter fertilizer, including Agrolution pHLow, with fulvic acid. Next slide, please. Similarly, this is for soybeans, same general area and soil type, compared to the corn trial I showed in the previous slide. Exact same treatments across the bottom of the graph, where we have ammonium polyphosphate, or 1034.0 at 3 gallons per acre, our 2 rates of Agrolution pHLow, supplying less total phosphorus, actually having a trend towards increased yield over 1034.0. And then again, the benefit of combining fulvic acid with the starter fertilizer. So as we explore this concept of using acidifying phosphorus fertilizers to potentially bring down the rate of total phosphorus applied as a starter fertilizer in these two examples, we do see that concept is playing out for corn and soybean. And now we'll change our focus towards potato, and AJ will describe and kind of talk through the last 3 examples as we finish up this afternoon.
Caroline, can we next slide, please? So this is a study that also was done in Wisconsin on potatoes back in 2020. And here we're comparing about 4 gallons of 1034.0 to 12 pounds of 1145.11 and 18 pounds of 1145.11. And that's also compared to a control. The soil has a pH of 6.2, and it also has, when you look at soil test P of 53 ppm, that would be considered on the high side. And so when we look at it from a P2O5, 4 gallons of 1034.0, you're talking about 16 pounds of P2O5, 12 pounds of Agrolution 1145.11, you're talking about 5.5 pounds, and 18, you're talking about 8 pounds of P2O5. So again, what we're seeing in terms of marketable potato yields, we're seeing at least compared to the control, we're seeing a significant increase. You're looking at almost 20 hundredweight increase there in yields, marketable yields, with far less phosphorus fertilizer. The 1034.0, I can't explain why we saw a yield decrease, but the only thing I've talked to a couple of growers on 1034.0, and one concern is always the storability and whether it maintains the quality during storability. And so but I can't explain exactly and say why we saw a yield decline with 1034.0 in this trial. But what we saw there, the Agrolution pHLow did show its value in terms of low rates, that acidity, that acidifying effect, making more phosphorus available in that system and increasing the potato yield. Next slide, please. So one thing when we think of phosphorus in potatoes is always tuber numbers. I mean, tuber numbers, as we said, higher your phosphorus, and we understand your yield comes from tuber numbers, and so increasing that tuber numbers. And here is where we're looking at different or different.
Yeah, I think we lost some formatting, AJ, but
yeah, but
each of these two sets of 4 bars. We have, two varieties. So the first 4 would be one variety. The 5 through 8 would be another variety. 1 and 5 would be a control. 2 and 6 would be 10-34-0, and then 3, 4, 7, 8 would be the Agrolution pHLow treatments.
Yeah. So I'd say if we take treatment 2, we're putting on that's about 10 gallons of 10-34-0. Treatment 3 is about 10 gallons of 11-45-11, and treatment 4 is about 20 gallons. So if we put that in terms of, I like to put it in terms of P2O5. So treatment 2 would be about 40 pounds of P2O5, and treatment 3 would be about 25 pounds, and treatment 4 would be about 40 pounds. And we could look, that would be treatment. So treatment 6, that would be equivalent to the 10-34, 40 pounds. Treatment 7 is 25 pounds, and treatment 8 would be 50 pounds. And what we see there is, depend on variety, and with phosphorus, variety in potatoes, variety, it makes a big difference. And so we see in the first variety, which is Mainstein, we see that the higher rates, having a higher rate of phosphorus, even with our 11-45-11, increase your tuber count. While when we look at like a Russet North Dakota, it's Norcota, Russet Norcota, which is the second variety, what we did see there is the lower rates of phosphorus actually increase the number of your tuber numbers. And a lot of that is, when we think of phosphorus and think of potatoes, we always say it's on different varieties, it comes down to root mass. How different varieties, different root mass, root density. And that could be, I don't know these varieties, but that could play a role in terms of the phosphorus demand. Is again, bear in mind, phosphorus is about the nutrient concentration, placement, and the root mass. So those 3 factors are playing a role, impacting how much of that phosphorus is going to be available for that uptake. Next slide, please. And there is a study from last year that actually, in which we're comparing again 10-34-0 at 20 gallons per acre versus Agrolution pHLow at 50. And so when you're thinking of 20 gallons, you're thinking almost 80 pounds of P2O5. And that compares to Agrolution of 50 pounds, which equivalent to around 22 pounds of your P2O5. So here, and we're seeing, again, you're seeing a higher slight yield increase, almost a 20 cubic, 100 weight. I'm used to ton per acre, 100 weight per acre increase in the potato yields. And again, what we're seeing is, and it's based on the concept is that acidic, the 2 ways to increase that phosphorus, 2 ways you can increase phosphorus availability. One, you can apply more phosphorus, or you can apply an acidifier that acidifies and make more phosphorus available. And so we're seeing in these instances, applying an acidifier to making more phosphorus available seems to have a better increasing that, giving bigger benefit in terms of phosphorus of it. One, in terms of the tuber numbers, and we're also seeing that in terms of yield, which also corresponds to tuber numbers. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendation for us, we see a recommendation for Agrolution of about 10 to 20 pounds per acre of Agrolution pHLow. And this is, when I think of it this way, because in my time looking at a lot of soil and Petiole and a lot of fertilizer application, the best practice that I've seen that have produced some of the highest yields and best results in terms of phosphorus management is where growers are putting on probably 100 to about 125 pounds of MAP as a dry spread pre-plant. Then they come back with 10-34-0, and they're putting on 50 to about 80 pounds of P2O5 in furrow at planting. And that in furrow at planting, most growers are putting it above the CPs, and that's important. We talk about placement. You want to put it above the seed piece, not below the seed piece. And then they come back at emergence and they're putting on fertigation of another 50 to about 80 pounds. And that's for a total of anything from 200 to about 260 pounds of total P2O5. So we're almost out of time, so I just one last, and so our recommendation is, this is where it fits into the system, where 1145-11 could replace, we could replace some of that 1034-0 going in furrow, where you could put on anything from 5 to 25 pounds of 1145-11, or then you could come back with a fertigation and you could be putting on anything from 5 to 15 pounds. So that's reducing your total application from 200 to 260 to about 100, 120 to about 150. And so that's really the big advantage, is that this Agrolution pHLow acidifying type fertilizer allows you to reduce that total application of phosphorus and still maintain the same yield on in your potato production system. And it also have the additional benefit of cleaning out irrigation, has some potential there as well, in terms of especially when you have hard water in your production system.
Well, thank you, AJ, and appreciate everyone who's hung with us till the end. I don't think we'll be able to answer all the questions live today, but I believe the Spudman team will be able to get those to us afterwards, and potentially answer those through email. Also, you can reach out to any one of us on the agronomy team for ICL here in North America. AJ is currently in the Pacific Northwest, but will be working throughout the southern and southeast United States. We have Christy Fallon, who's another potato expert on our team, based in Idaho. She's responsible for the Western U.S. and then I have the balance of the U.S. and Canada as well. But between the three of us, we can help fill you in on these trials that we showed today, or answering any other questions you might have about PeKacid or Agrolution pHLow. On behalf of ICL, again, thank you for tuning in today, and we'll let Chris and Caroline kind of wrap it up for us.
Yeah, I appreciate all the good information from both of you. Certainly that's a lot to think about. And I would like to say that I want to thank everybody for joining us. We did have some good questions. So thanks for all the participants. And lastly, thanks ICL for sponsoring the webinar. Please keep an eye out for future webinars from Spudman via our email list and our social media platforms. And thank you.